IKSHT. And um, like Mariah said, I will be presenting on working with male victims. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and get started. So working with male victims of sexual violence. Um, our learning objectives today are to gain a better understanding of the incidents of male victimization, to recognize some unique barriers to reporting for male victims. We'll discuss some facts and myths around male victimization, identify strategies and resources for working with male victims, and also explore the lasting impact of male victimization. Feel free to leave any comments or questions in the chat throughout this entire presentation, and we can answer them through as they come or at the end, depending on the question. So thank you all for listening, and here we go. So the first thing before we get started with the information is I'm asking all of you to type into the chat. I have two questions for you to discuss. My first question is, when you think about what it means to be a man, what traits come to mind? So if we could take about 30 seconds or less to answer that question in the chat. Strong, strong, being supportive in society, macho, societal pressure to provide, agreed. Traditionally, yeah, being a protector, provider. If you identify as a man, you are a man. Right. And so, yes, those are all some good responses. I'm thinking when I ask this question, traditionally, what it means, what does society teach you about being a man? And these comments definitely reflect the standard that is put on men in today's society, being misunderstood, can't not being able to ask for help. Great responses. My next question is, what does it mean to be a victim? Can we think about what it means to be a victim and type of responses in the chat? Absolutely. When you are a victim, a lot of times you are characterized as weak. It means to be alone. Left behind, suffer consequences of someone else's actions. Absolutely. Not being believed, interrogated. Yeah, absolutely. Being blamed for being a victim. Absolutely. A lot of times when you are a victim, you think, or people think, that the victim let this happen. And so these responses are absolutely, what it means to be a victim. And so oftentimes, when it comes to masculinity or what it means to be a man in society, and then the image of being a victim, there is some conflict in those two terms for masculinity and victim, and that conflict is a struggle when it comes to men being able to acknowledge what their experiences are. And so we'll talk about what that looks like. Can men be victims? Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. So traditionally in society, there is and it goes all the way back to the beginning of time. There is a tradition for men to be a certain type of man. And if you are anything other, then you are perceived as less than. Tony Porter and a collective of preventionists and speakers or workers in our field that speak on healthy masculinity have coined the term the man box, which means men are to be fit inside of this box, and you can only be in that box and be a man. And what that does is it creates this societal constructs creates this limit that limits the choices and expressions of men and boys to make sure that they're stuck in this traditional masculine role and they have certain values. And oftentimes it keeps men from exploring certain gender constructs. It creates a type of gender identity crisis. And so what that looks like is and the man box, what that looks like is to be a man, considered a man, there are things that you cannot do and certain things that you have to do. And you cannot openly express your emotions. You cannot cry. Anger is great for you to show, but any other emotions are unacceptable. You can't express weakness or fear. You can't be like a gay man. You can't be like a woman. You can't ask for help. But you can definitely demonstrate your power control, especially over women. You can be aggressive or dominating, especially when you are playing sports and athletics. Like all rules go out the door. You can be as tough as you got to be. You got to be athletic and strong. You have to be the decision maker or a leader. You got to be heterosexual. Um, you objectify women. You're always sexually active. Women are your property or objects to use for your benefit. So there are certain things that you have to do to be a man, and there are things that you cannot do. This is just how it's traditionally been to be a man. And in this field, a lot of us know that this is not really the case. Like that's not really what it means. But when society has a heck of an influence on how people behave and what people think. And so because of those standards that have been set in society, and even when you are raised a certain way, once you get into the world, oftentimes those standards hold strong and it creates a conflict within yourself. And so as workers in this field, it's important that we think about our perceptions of manhood and we challenge ourselves to kind of think about what we've been taught traditionally, what the men that we work with have been taught traditionally, and to kind of come at it from a different angle of kind of what somebody mentioned in one of the comments, like if you are a man, you are a man. If you are a father, an uncle, a brother, that's who you are, no matter what the gender roles tell you to be or tell you to do. So we got to challenge our perception of manhood and what that looks like. So understanding that what our understanding of as men or what men are, that will help us when it comes to advocacy for male victimization, and male survivors. So think about some things when you're working with men. How do you perceive gender roles? Do you have any cultural biases that as they relate to different types of men, like men of color, for example, or transgender men? Do you have men whose fathers didn't really have good role models in their lives? Are they less than men because they don't know how to be men? Or do you have difficulty serving certain populations of men, like gay men or atheists, or um, some men that are both perpetrators and victims? Do we have difficulty serving them because of their actions, not really taking into consideration of the victimization that they faced oftentimes as kids? And do you have a history of seeing or experiencing men as perpetrators? Um, do you have all the men that you've worked with or seen in your personal experience, have they all been perpetrators? And does that impact the work that you do with the people that you work with? So just keep these things in mind and try to be intentional about the work that you do, and oftentimes that's a great start when it comes to working with male survivors. Okay, transition in a little bit. What are in the chat? Let's think of some settings in which that we have heard male sexual victimization takes place. What are some places or some areas in the world or in our lives that we believe men can become victims? So Christy said the nail salon. I'm thinking you mean you talk about it at the nail salon, or maybe I think that's what you mean. They talk about it at the nail salon. Um, in the locker room, men can be victims. Military, at work, absolutely. College frats. The stereotype is prison and military, absolutely. Oh, the boys were victimized. Okay, thanks for clarifying that. The boys were victimized in nail salons. Where my scroll? Absolutely. At home, male youth. Absolutely. And so it's kind of a trick question. Like, we try to think about specific places where men can become victims, but really it's really similar to female victims. Like, it's anywhere, right? Like any place you can go, can become a victim. Yeah, there are I guess situations that have, excuse me, like um there are situations that have taken more of the lead, like when it comes to what society says where this stuff happens. For example, like in churches or like Boy Scouts. But ultimately, men can be victims exactly at home, at school, in the community. There's not really a limit. And that's a stereotype that it only happens in certain places in certain ways, but really it happens all the time. The same way that women are victims from in different categories, from young women to adult women, it happens often. And so that's just something to keep in mind. There's not really a certain time or place where it happens to men. It happens in all kinds of places. The most, like somebody said, I think it was Amanda, she beat me to the punch. There are definitely some stereotypes to prison and military, and there a vast majority of victims of sexual assault when it comes to men, it happens in the prisons and in the military system. Um, Compared to like in the general public, the majority of victims are still women. Uh, the stereotypes when it comes to prisons is that men who have experienced sexual violence deserve what they get because they're in prison in the first place, or they're lying about the assault that happens when it does happen because they just want to get out of their cell. They just want a few minutes for to get away from the terrors and horrors of prison. Or he is lying about what happened because he's upset that he didn't get his commissary money. So that's an excuse to blame and say that's something that they were assaulted when they really weren't. In the military, male victims are still the minority, and the things that you hear about the military victims is, why didn't you fight them off? You're this tough masculine man, or um, so why didn't you protect yourself? Or on the flip side, well, you got caught doing something you weren't supposed to be doing, so now you're saying it was sexual assault, even though you're gay, or don't tell because you're gay. And so again, there is a not only a stereotype, but there is a ton of victim blaming when it comes to men in these scenarios, um, which makes it hard for men to men's disclosures to be taken at face value. So a few statistics about the real world and what sexual violence really looks like for men. About 1 in 4 male victims um, of completed rape and or attempted rape, it happens between the ages of 11 and 17. And so it happens very young. It can happen when you're older, but it definitely happens when you're young. And a lot of these things go unreported. 1 in 16 men are sexually assaulted during their time in college. And about 1 in 14 men, which is 7.1%, or nearly 7.9 million in the US, were made to penetrate someone else, either being attempted or actually completing it during their lifetime. 1 in 71 men will be raped at some point in time in their lives. And again, just like statistics, when it comes to female victimization, a lot of these go unreported as well. So these are the best statistics that can be found out there. And we assume that the numbers are higher than they are, simply because we know a lot of people are not reporting. And so it happens 1 in 16, 1 in 71, 1 in 14. Sometimes that doesn't seem as much as like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5, but it's still a lot. It's way too many, and it happens. And so that's, again, just some statistics for everybody. There's some groups that are at heightened risk, which are um, typically which are similar to the statistics when it comes to women: gay, bisexual, transgender, genderqueer, gender nonconforming individuals are at a heightened risk for sexual victimization. The stats say 26% of gay men and 37% of bisexual men experience rape or physical violence, compared to 29% of heterosexual men, and 40% of gay men and 47% of bisexual men have experienced sexual violence other than rape, compared to 21% of heterosexual men. And so just thinking about victimization in general, not always talking about rape. Sometimes it's sexual assault, sometimes it's sodomy, sometimes it's stalking, but anything on our spectrum of sexual violence and victimization, men still experience that at higher rates than they should. Sometimes the CDC says sometimes peers may use sexual assault as a form of punishment for individuals perceived deviants, or in order to cure them. And so that means that sometimes when you think about, like, when parents or when churches or parents or churches, kind of in this example, realize that their son is gay, the parents might do it themselves, or they might send them to the church, and they might make them hook up with a girl, to think, well, if you have sex with a girl, we can cure you. We just need to show you what sex is supposed to be. Or you got in trouble one way or another, and so we'll use sex as a punishment by forcing you to do something that you don't want to do, which is kind of, I don't have a better word for it. It's crazy, but that is the thought process sometimes of individuals who force sex onto other individuals, especially young men. When you think about prison or the military, a lot of times when it comes to punishment, and sometimes even in like gang culture or um, yeah, gang culture, you can use sex or penetration as a way to discipline or to punish individuals for not following rules. So if it's happening so much, why aren't men reporting it? And I want to pause here to just show a brief clip. So about a minute of Terry Crews's opening statement during C-SPAN. For those of you who are not familiar with Terry Crews, he's a ex-NFL player, an actor. He experienced sexual assault at a event with an agent at some celebrity event, and he had an experience. He's going to talk about it briefly. We'll just listen to a minute, but if you've never seen this video, we'll share it at the end. You should take the time and just kind of listen to his explanation of what he experienced and why he's now an advocate for sexual violence.
We can't hear it, Howard.
Great. Thanks for saying that. So let me fix that real quick. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Sorry, everybody. Give me just a second. All right, can you hear it now?
You're not sharing your screen, so
That obviously makes sense. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Can you hear that?
No.
No? Okay. I thought I had it set up. I'm sorry. Um, okay, you know what? We'll just not do that because I don't have it together. I apologize, but I have watched it several times and I can just explain that basically a little less eloquently than he explained it. He says that he talks about his experience. Then he talks about how his agent grabbed him by his testicles in front of everybody and how humiliating that was, that experience. Um, and the reason that he had a hard time coming forward is because he just felt so emasculated. And the responses that he got from society was, you are a man and you should have defended yourself. And so not only him coming forward about what he experienced, but also him listening to his colleagues, his female counterparts, and other women in the world coming forward with their Me Too stories. It kind of encouraged him to advocate differently than he ever has. And so the whole point of just showing that was that he's a well-known celebrity, um, that has also experienced sexual violence, and he's one of the few prominent men who have been willing to come forward and discuss his feelings. And he talks about specifically that how he felt emasculated and embarrassed, and how he was ridiculed through his experiences. And so it was just a video to kind of switch it up, but that is a huge reason of why men don't report, because oftentimes there is this expectation of you should be able to defend yourself. It didn't really happen to you. And also that's the outward experience, but the inward experience is how just emasculating it can feel when somebody takes advantage of you like that. And so, again, I'll share the link just in case you have about 6 minutes to watch the entire thing. And I think it could be really impactful to watch. Moving on. So, it's always important to know kind of a history of change that happens. And so, thinking about the definition of rape through the year 2012, ever since laws have been laws, there has been a specific law when it comes to the FBI and rape, or excuse me, there's a specific law or definition when it comes to rape. And what it was the carnal knowledge of a female forcibly against her will, which left out offenses involving oral and anal penetration, penetration with objects, and the rape of males. And so, this, by definition, men could not be raped, which also gave men a hard time when it came to reporting because there was nothing to report because it couldn't legally happen to you. And so, just 10 years ago, in 2013, the law had been updated and to a better definition, which says the penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any part of the body or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. And so it's extremely, it's, to me, I believe it's more specific, and um, it's specific, and it's general enough that it's for any person, which is the key word, key part for me, the key part for everyone. Now men have something to report, which makes a huge difference. And so this is also important to just think about, um, like these laws, and this is how society's standard move forward. So I think people outside of, I call people outside of the work that we do, civilians. And so, like, the civilian mind doesn't even, a lot of times these definitions, these laws are not publicized. They just changed, and we just go on with our business. And so a lot of times, like, you don't even know that things like this are happening behind the scenes, that there was even an issue when it came to how you could report some type of sexual assault or rape. And so, it's been 10 years, um, and that's an important change. But I also think that, society in general, and just the expectations about men and how men are perceived, and how men should behave, and male victimization is still way further behind than it should be. Victim blaming, again, we've kind of talked about it throughout. Oftentimes, especially with men, with women, there's victim blaming. She wanted it. She shouldn't be out that late at night, or she shouldn't wear certain things. Well, for men, it's also a part of, the reason why men don't report. It's often tied to sexism, misogyny, homophobia, and all sorts of other stuff. And a common types of victim blaming is, again, why didn't you fight them off, or how couldn't you let this happen? Um, a lot of times, like the statistics say, men are not only assaulted by men, but it happens sometimes with women. And your attacker was a woman, so you must have liked it. Or you're gay, that means you probably like it too. So, again, blaming the victim, finding any reason to not acknowledge that there was something harmful that happened, harmful or unwanted that happened to an individual. You're definitely judged as a man that, um, you should want, um, you should want the attack to happen, or it wasn't an attack because it was a woman, and you should have invited it, and any man would be happy to have this experience with a woman. Again, just blaming the victim. Those types of things make it hard um, to excuse me, to report the victimization. So how do we should we respond to a male victim? Kind of like a similar message that I've been saying. A lot of these things are the same when it comes to female victims. You want to listen carefully to what's being said, what's being shared. You want to assure him that you are believing him, assist him, whenever, in whatever way that he needs, ask how they need help, ask what would be helpful. Never say that the rape is the victim's fault, especially if he's feeling guilty. Um, don't tell him that going along with the rape did not mean that you were given. I mean, excuse me. Do tell him that going along with the rapist did not mean you were giving your permission. That is a survival instinct. That is a survival technique. When somebody is telling you to do something because you feel like you are in danger and you go along with it, that doesn't mean that you wanted it or you gave somebody permission. Um, Make sure you acknowledge that whatever that person is feeling, it's okay to feel those feelings, and oftentimes tell them that you know you did everything right, you survived it, and now how do you want to move forward? What will make you comfortable moving forward? You don't press for details. You don't give somebody the third degree who's been a victim of an assault. You don't make the decisions for the survivor of the experience. You want to encourage them with options. You want, if they are open to hearing them and receiving them, but you want to them making being in control gives them the power back that they just lost. So you want to make sure that the victim, when we talk about male victims, he is in control of his decisions and what happens next. You don't ask, what did you do to lead the rapist on? It doesn't matter what you do. Nobody should be sexually assaulted or raped. Um, you don't ask, why didn't you scream or run or fight back? That's all different types of victim blaming. Um, what you try to change in the experience, or, you know, what I would have done in this situation, that's not helpful. And stating, I know how you're feeling. A lot of time, more often than not, you don't. I mean, unless you have experienced the assault, you don't really have an idea. I mean, we know how it feels through our knowledge and work, but we don't personally know how it feels. That's not something the survivor wants to hear. And even if you have experienced your own assault in the past, your feelings and the next person's feelings can still be different. And so we just want to let them have their experience and be a resource to them, but we don't want to hijack their story or make decisions for them in the moment. How can you help your agency systematically respond better to male victims? So, in the work that we do, how can not only individually, but your agency that you work with, um, how can you help respond better? And one way we can do that, this primary prevention, one way we do that is by educating ourselves and others, and not believing in some of these myths that surround male victimization. And so what we'll do here for the next um, I believe, 4 or 5 slides, is we'll talk about some of the most common myths when it comes to male victimization. I'm gonna read a question and ask you all to type true or false in the chat, and then we'll discuss it uh, almost immediately after you respond. Okay. So question number one, fact or fiction? If a man gets an erection or ejaculates during an assault, it means he wanted it. Overwhelming, quickly responding false. Exactly. Um, Arousal is a natural body response and something that you can't control. These are normal physiological responses that do not imply that you wanted or invited the assault. And most men, almost all teenage boys, have experienced unwanted or unintentional arousal. And so that's a key part that men and young men, especially young men, experience and believe that this happened to me, and because I became aroused or ejaculated during the experience, I liked it. It's extremely easy, just with the biology of a man, for the arousal to happen, especially young men going through puberty. A lot of young boys sitting in the classroom are aroused, just sitting there staring off into space. Like, it's crazy how easy it happens. And so you can only imagine the body's response to touch. And it doesn't mean that it was wanted. Um, it's just a natural response, and it's important that when we are working with these young men or working with older men, whatever age group, um, that we know that and that we remind them of that. The next question: if a man is assaulted by a woman, it's not really assault. He's just being assertive, or she was just being assertive, and he should consider himself lucky. Right, false. Overwhelming responses, which is true. So we all kind of know, like traditionally, again, the stereotype of when with the society says that men are always horny, always ready for sex, the hot teacher mentality, um, the fantasies through society, the pornography that is out there that people watch. There is this stigma that men always want to have sex, and that men daydream about their stepmom or their teacher or some type of women in a power position. And that when that happens, your babysitter, when that happens, you should want it and you are lucky. And um, that is false. It's inappropriate. There's definitely a power dynamic um, that is tied into that. Again, if it's unwanted contact, if it's unwanted and you're unasked, um, and it's not asked for, it's assault. And nobody's lucky to be touched or manipulated in a way that they didn't like or they didn't ask for. Being made to penetrate someone is a form of sexual violence. Absolutely true. Um, this is a form of violence experienced mostly by males. Um, there is, again, kind of going along with like the the characterization that men are always ready to have sex, or that's what boys do, that's what men do. If they're with that power dynamic, it often comes with the power dynamic. It's typically older in this experience. It's a older when it's women, an older woman that like a babysitter or a teacher or a coach that is asking the men to penetrate them, to penetrate the woman. And even though that happens, um, that doesn't mean that they wanted it. That's not, there are always outliers and, other examples where men are being asked to penetrate other men, but a lot of times it's being asked to penetrate a woman. And it's the same thing. It's still rape, it's still sexual coercion. Um, and just because the man does what he's being asked to do, especially in that power dynamic, it doesn't mean that they consent. I think this is the last one. If a young boy is sexually abused by a male perpetrator, he will definitely grow up to be gay. False. Right. Absolutely. There's no evidence that shows this to be true. Sexual orientation is a complex issue, and if we don't assume that perpetrators can make female victims, um, that male perpetrators can make female victims lesbians, then why do we assume the parallel is the same? Um, and so it's just not true. Um, Even if a child is sexually abused or gay and realizes that they are gay later in life, it doesn't mean that that experience that they enjoyed it or that was the trigger to it. And also, sexual abuse complicates a child's ability to naturally discover or accept their sexual orientation. And so, not only is it not true, but it may also confuse that person as they try to grow up and discover themselves outside of the assault that happened. This is definitely the last one. An abused male will always go on to abuse someone else. False. And the key word is always. It's true that hurt people. Um, and that's kind of in general with all things. Hurt people do hurt people, based off of their past experience, but not it's not a mandatory thing. It's not a definitive thing that will absolutely happen all the time. Um, excuse me. It is not true that most boys who are sexually abused will go on to sexually abuse others. It does happen, but it's not an overwhelming majority. Um, but you do find that a lot of perpetrators of sexual assault, that a lot of perpetrators who are currently incarcerated, they have experienced some type of assault throughout their childhood. It doesn't excuse their actions. They do still have to be held responsible for what they've done as an adult, or whenever it happened. Even children, child abusers, children that have abused other children. But at the same time, that does provide some context, um, that, especially when it happens young, it could definitely damage the psyche, and play a part in that experience. The myth is dangerous because it can create fear for boys and men, making them feel even more guilty or ashamed of the abuse that they've endured. And so these are some of the most well-known myths that society, just because of how society is, has created, and that has been ingrained in a lot of us. And so these are some things that if we can know better, we'll do better. Um, or you would like to think so, right? And so we want to keep these things in mind when we work with our male victims, and be sure to encourage them that these truths, or the ones that are false, are not always consistent. There's a lasting impact of sexual violence. What that looks like, on the mental, emotional side is if somebody had a question or wanted to say something? No? Okay. Um, what that looks like on the mental, emotional side is sexual violence will cause depression, suicidal thoughts or ideations, attempts. There's a distrust for others that happens if you feel, shame, unworthiness, guilty, isolation, just overall sadness, a host of negative emotions, that come as a result of being sexually assaulted. Physically, there may be some difficulty in your future sexual or romantic relationships. Erectile dysfunction is an issue. Muscle aches and pains, tension, headaches, difficulty sleeping, nightmares, night sweats. There are a ton of things that can happen both physically and mentally as a result of sexual violence. And so keep these things in mind as you're working with people, that body might just ache for some reason, long after the assault. It never happened before, but it could be your way of processing, the experience, and um, that's just your mind and your body's way of dealing with the tragedy that happened to you. So some coping strategies. A lot of time there are negative ones. People self-medicate with alcohol and drugs or sex. You abuse others. You isolate yourself physically or through disassociation. Um, People work a lot, or you struggle at work. Um, and so there are other coping strategies that people try too, but these are just a few. It's not all inclusive. Um, Against a big one is sexual promiscuity. It's not always Sex is not always negative, but when it's used as a drug or as an escape, that's when it becomes dangerous. And so some positive ways to encourage coping strategy, or some positive coping strategies to encourage, are counseling, or therapy. Or whether I think counseling is more of a strength-based way to say it. Talking to somebody who is licensed, or certified in an experience in a healing process. There's art therapy, or other mediums similar to that. There's safe consensual touch is a way to encourage that is still real. And as you move forward in your relationships, there are still appropriate ways to engage, that that it might take time to get comfortable with, but there are still appropriate ways to engage in sex, and that is knowing that the touch needs to be consensual, constantly consensual throughout the entire experience. Sports and hobbies are a great idea, ways to cope with some of those negative emotions, those physical and mental emotions that happen. Um, Diving into your spirituality is a positive coping strategy for a lot of people, and volunteer work, just things to take your mind off, positive ways to take your mind off or to work through the experience that you happen that won't negatively impact your body or your mind. And again, this list is not all inclusive, but it's just um, a few things to encourage or to recommend when you work with male victims. Any questions about just the entire presentation, the male victim experience? Anybody working with male victims right now and looking for resources? Are there any questions or concerns or comments? Great. I'll take that to mean that this was an excellent presentation and it was extremely clear and concise. Thank you all. If there is at any time you have any questions or need support in the work that you do or resources, please feel free to reach out to myself or Mariah or just ICAST in general, and we will um, definitely help you in any way that we can. Um, I believe Mariah has the slides and will distribute them to you all as she does her thing. So be patient with her for that. I know she has a lot of great work to do.